30,000 feet on a moonless night. A thin haze of smoke was drifting down the length of the cabin, and the captain's voice came over the speakers, calling a name that not one person on this flight knew belonged to me. Commander Vance. Vesper. If you can hear me, I need you at the aft doors. Here's what you need to know about that moment. A passenger jet was falling through the dark, hunting for a runway. Emergency strip lighting had come up along the floor. 180 people were gripping their seats. And somewhere up front, in business class, my brother had, less than an hour earlier, told the man beside him that his little sister was the one who ran off to join the Navy chasing dreams too big for her, and then quietly dissolved into a job even she wouldn't bother to name. The kind of job, the way he told it, that a person takes once they've run out of places left to fall. No one on this airplane knew that the quiet woman sitting back in economy, the one who had spent the whole flight turning an old brass compass over and over in her hand, had flown the F-18F Super Hornet for 16 years. No one knew that the calm voice the captain had just called over the speakers was the voice that had once brought men low on fuel back down to a carrier deck in the dark. My brother least of all. The compass needle in my hand still pointed one way, steady, unwavering, the way it always had since it lived in my father's coat pocket. I closed my hand around it. Then I unbuckled my seatbelt and stood up. But for you to understand why that name, spoken over a loudspeaker in a cabin full of smoke, was the thing that changed everything between me and my brother, I have to go back a few hours. To what my whole family believed about me. And to a will. My father built ships. For 40 years he ran a small shipyard in a harbor town, putting together cargo vessels and tugboats with his own hands and a stubbornness that both of his children inherited in different ways. He died last winter, suddenly, in the middle of an ordinary morning. And that night's flight was carrying me back to that harbor town for the dedication of a memorial plaque in his honor, on the pier he had built. The shipyard went to my brother, Daniel. He's 4 years older than me, and since our father died, he's the one who holds everything. The yard, the house, the money, and the story of our family that he tells the rest of the world. In that story, Daniel is the child who stayed, who carried the weight, who did the right thing. And I am the daughter who turned her back on the family to chase airplanes, the one who abandoned her aging father to run around the world doing things that, the way he tells it, never went anywhere. He has a tidy version he tells the relatives. That I went into the Navy with big dreams, that I washed out of the real flight program, and that now I work some desk job having to do with logistics that I'm too embarrassed to spell out. He tells it in a voice with just enough pity to sound kind, and just enough poison that each retelling shrinks me a little more. The truth is different. I am Commander Elena Vance, United States Navy, retired. In the air wing they called me Vesper. I flew the F-18F Super Hornet for 16 years, logging more than 3,000 flight hours and more than 300 night landings onto the deck of an aircraft carrier, a number very few pilots on Earth ever reach. Because setting down at night onto a deck that is pitching and heaving in the middle of the ocean is one of the hardest and most frightening things the flying profession has ever devised. I commanded a squadron. I never lost a single one of the aviators under my command. You might want to ask why I let Daniel tell his story all those years without correcting it. The answer is simpler than you'd think. There was a time when I tried. I sat at family dinners and tried to tell the true version, and I watched it go nowhere, because Daniel didn't need the truth. He needed a story in which he stood taller than me. So I stopped. I discovered that when you know exactly what you've done, you don't need anyone else to know it with you. There's a freedom in that which took me years to understand. Daniel's story only carried weight for as long as I kept coming to wrestle the right to define myself out of his hands. The day I stopped wrestling for it, those stories went weightless. They were still told. At dinners, on the phone between relatives, but they couldn't touch me anymore, because I had carried the real me off the scale he kept setting it on. I let him keep the scale. I carried myself somewhere else. And there's something I noticed about my brother over all those years. He needs an audience. Not friends, not exactly, but strangers who have never heard his story and will believe it. The story he loves to tell most, the one that makes him look tallest, is always the story of the little sister who threw her chance away. I wonder whether he ever realized that every time he shrank me down, he was trying to pull himself up. Probably not. There are people who never hear themselves. I let him keep his story. I kept our father's compass. It was the only thing I asked for from his estate. Not the yard. Not the house. Not the money. Just the brass pocket compass he carried his whole life. When I was small, he put it in my hand and told me the thing he believed more than anything else in the world. A good ship, he said, is a ship that brings people home. Everything else is just metal. I boarded that night with the last group, in an economy seat I paid for myself, and I saw Daniel in business class as I passed. He didn't see me. Or he saw me and decided not to, which he has always been good at. He was leaned back in his seat, telling a story to the man beside him, filling the whole corner of the cabin with his voice, the way he always did in every room he walked into. And as I passed, I caught a fragment of the story. I heard the words little sister. I heard the word pity. I heard him say that some people are born to fly high and some people aren't. And then he laughed the kind of laugh that lets the listener understand he'd filed his own sister under the second kind. I didn't stop. I went on to my seat, stowed my bag, sat down and took out the compass. Its needle wobbled and then settled, pointing the way it always pointed. I closed my hand around it and looked out the window, into the dark thickening as we climbed. I promised I'd tell you about the name. Vesper. You don't give yourself a call sign in the air wing. Someone else gives it to you, and usually they give it to tease. But mine came from a night I will never tell in full, a night that mostly stays behind closed doors and always will. You only need to know this much. There was a ship, an ocean, and a storm. We were operating far from shore, which means there was no airfield to divert to, no backup runway anywhere. There was only the deck, and if you couldn't get down onto the deck, you couldn't get down at all. That night the ship's landing guidance systems failed in the bad weather, and there were several aircraft up there in the dark, running low on fuel, losing their bearings, stacking fear higher with every minute that passed. I had finished my own work that night and could have gone down first. But I stayed on the frequency. I held my altitude and I became the voice for those pilots, one at a time, bringing them around through each turn, keeping them calm, reading them the numbers they couldn't read for themselves in the dark, until one by one their wheels touched the deck. I was the last voice each of them heard before they made it home safe. I remember how the ship rose and fell on the night display, a tiny rectangle drifting on a bottomless black ocean. I remember the voice of each pilot as they called in, the way fear crept into their words even as they fought to keep it from showing. And I remember what I learned that night about guiding a human being through the worst moment of their life. You don't put out their fear. You just give them something else to hold on to besides it. A number, a heading, a voice that doesn't shake. You become the fixed point in a spinning world, and you hold it until their wheels touch the deck. Then you let go, and you move to the next one. Afterward, one of those pilots, a young man I had never met, sought me out and said that my voice on the frequency sounded like an evening bell. The bell that rings at dusk, he said, the one that tells you the day is done and you're almost home. Vesper. In Latin it means the evening, the first star that appears when the sky goes dark. The name stuck to me from that night on. My squadron was based at Lemoore, out in California, the Navy's master jet station in the dry, cracked farmland of the Central Valley, where nearly every Super Hornet pilot in the Pacific Fleet passes through sooner or later. That was home. For a while. For years I didn't think much about it. It was a long time before I saw that the name and the thing my father believed sat in the same place. My father built ships that carried people across the sea to get home. I became a voice that carried people through the dark to get home. Daniel inherited the yard. But the yard was never the thing that truly belonged to our family. That thing was a calling, and it wasn't written into any will. That night, at 30,000 feet, the flight was smooth. The cabin lights had been dimmed low. Most of the passengers were sleeping or looking into their screens. I wasn't sleeping. I rarely sleep on airplanes. There's a part of me that never truly switches off in the air. A part that goes on listening to the sounds an airplane makes. The sounds you learn after enough hours to tell the normal from the not. And that's why I smelled it before anyone else could see it. A very faint smell. Hot plastic and electricity. The smell every pilot is taught to fear. Because on an airplane there is nothing more frightening than the thing you smell before you see. I sat up straight. No panic. It was just that everything in me went quiet and began to pay attention. That old part moving from the background to the foreground without asking my permission. For about 30 seconds, I was the only person on the airplane who knew something was wrong. Then the smell thickened, and a thin thread of smoke began to seep from the seam of a ceiling panel ahead of me, and the people around me started to smell it too. A woman a few rows up cried out. A flight attendant moved quickly toward the front, her face holding its professional calm but her step saying something else. Then the captain's voice came over the speakers, short and tight, the kind of brevity you only hear from someone doing far too many things at once. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain. We have a smoke situation in the cabin. I am taking the aircraft down and diverting to the nearest airport for an immediate landing. Flight attendants, prepare the cabin. This is not a drill. And then the airplane put its nose down. Not a panicked plunge. It was an emergency descent flown by the book, the nose dropping to a firm angle, the engines pulled back, the aircraft shedding altitude as fast as it safely could. Because on an airplane full of smoke, the only thing that matters is getting it down to the ground and getting everyone out before the smoke does its work. I knew exactly what the captain was doing, and I knew he was doing it right, and I knew it meant we had very little time. On an airplane with smoke, time is the real enemy, not altitude. Smoke kills before fire does. It fills a sealed cabin in minutes, blurs the eyes, chokes the lungs, turns a clear exit into something a person can't find. Every pilot is taught that number, the brief span you have between the first sign of smoke and the moment everything becomes too late. And that number is so short it burns an urgency into you that you never forget. The captain knew that number. That's why he didn't circle, didn't weigh his options, didn't do anything but put the nose down and race for the nearest runway. He was racing against a clock that no passenger in the cabin could see. And I knew one more thing that clock hadn't spoken yet. When the last door finally opened, everything would come down to whether the people in this cabin stepped out in order or threw themselves at each other. I had seen both. And I knew how thin the distance between them is, and that it gets decided in the minutes before the wheels touch the ground, not after. The cabin began to come apart. Not all at once. Fear in a sealed cabin spreads like smoke, slow and then fast. Someone started to cry. A man shot up out of his seat and was told to sit down. The voices rose into the thick, heavy hum of 180 people realizing at the same moment that they had no control over what was about to happen to them. The smoke wasn't heavy, but it was enough to see. And nothing turns worry into panic faster than seeing smoke in a metal tube at 30,000 feet. And in business class, I heard my brother. I heard Daniel's voice rise above the others, and this time it wasn't filling the room with stories. It climbed high and went thin with fear. He was asking a flight attendant what was happening, asking louder than he needed to, asking it again when the answer didn't come fast enough. The man who always took over every room with sound was now taking over this cabin with his fear, and I realized that in all those years I had never once heard my brother afraid. I did the opposite. I felt myself go quiet. I felt my breathing slow. The fear was still there. It's always there. But it stepped back into the compartment where I'd been putting it for 16 years. The compartment where I set everything that won't help in the next few minutes. I began to read the cabin the way I used to read a cockpit. Source of the smoke, forward and to the left. The exits, both sides and to the rear. The most panicked person. Not the one crying loudest, but the one who had gone most silent. The woman in the seat next to mine sitting rigid with empty eyes. The kind of freeze that is far more dangerous than a scream. We kept descending. 20,000 feet. 15,000. Somewhere below the clouds and the night rain was a runway, and between us and it were a few minutes, and in those few minutes, How everyone in this cabin behaved would decide whether they walked off this airplane on their own 2 feet. I unclipped my seatbelt a notch. And I began to do the thing that, as it turned out, I had always been born to do. There's something I learned in 16 years that no classroom can teach. In a crisis, the most dangerous thing is not the fire or the altitude or the failing machine. The most dangerous thing is people when they stop thinking. An airplane full of smoke can still land. A cabin full of panicking people trampling each other at an exit door. No one can save. The flight attendant nearest me was a young woman, and she was trying with everything she had, but I saw in her what I had seen in young pilots during their first time in the fight. She was being overwhelmed. Too many hands going up, too many voices calling out, too much fear funneling toward one person, and her eyes were starting to take on the look of someone about to lose the ability to act. I touched her arm as she passed. I kept my voice low and level, the voice that leaves no room for argument. Look at me. I've done this before. Give me the back section. You take the front. I'll hold the people around here. She looked at me for a second, the kind of second in which a person decides whether or not to trust you, and then something in the way I said it gave her a place to plant her feet. She nodded. And suddenly she was a little less overwhelmed, because the weight had just been divided, and because someone had spoken to her in a voice that sounded like it knew the way out. I stood up in the aisle. My left knee complained as I straightened, the way it always does when the air turns cold. 16 years folded into a tight cockpit leaves its marks. I didn't shout. People think leading in a crisis means shouting, but the opposite is true. When everyone around you is getting loud, the way you make them pay attention is to drop your voice, forcing them to go quiet to hear you. I began to speak to the people around me, one row at a time, in short, clear sentences. Fasten your seatbelt. Bend down when I tell you to. Take off your high heels. Count the rows to the nearest exit, ahead of you and behind you, so that if the lights go out you can still find it by hand. And a strange thing happened. The people I spoke to began to calm down. Not because I told them everything would be fine. I didn't say that. I didn't know if it would be. But because I gave them something to do. A mind with a task in it has no room left for panic. It's what I used to do for pilots low on fuel in the dark. And it turned out to be just as true for frightened people in a cabin full of smoke. I turned to the frozen woman beside me. She was the one I worried about most, because she had gone too far into her fear to come back on her own. I sat down in the empty seat next to her. I didn't ask if she was all right. She wasn't, and a question like that only confirms it. Instead, I took her hand and gave her a very small task, small enough that a paralyzed mind could still hold it. Count for me, I said. Count the rows from here to the door behind us. Touch each seat back as you count. I need that number. And she counted. Her hand shook. Her voice was as small as a breath, but she counted. And as she counted, her eyes came back from the far place they had wandered to. That was all she needed. A task small enough that the fear couldn't swallow it. Then I saw it. In the row by the overwing exit, a man had stood up, and his hand was gripping the door release. He didn't mean to hurt anyone. He was just panicking, and instinct was telling him the way out was right there, and he had to open it now. But we were still in the air, and even if we hadn't been, opening an exit door at the wrong time, before the aircraft came to a full stop, before someone confirmed there was no fire on that side, could kill more people than the smoke. I reached him in 3 steps. I put my hand over his, firm, and I pulled his eyes to me. Not now, I said. If you open that door right now, you kill all of us. I need you to do something else. You sit in this exact seat. When the airplane stops and someone tells you to open it, you'll be the one who opens it, and you'll help the others out. That's your job. Can you do that? I saw it happen in his eyes. The panic found a frame to pour itself into. He nodded. He sat down. He put his hands on his knees and waited, and he had a job now instead of a terror. We were still descending. I could feel it in my ears, the pressure changing as the altitude fell away, and I could feel it in the way the airplane shuddered as it pushed through the lower, thicker, rain-filled air. Somewhere up front, 2 people in the cockpit were doing 10 things at once, each of them important, and they were doing them with a clock ticking in their heads. I couldn't help them with the airplane. But I could help them with the thing they couldn't tend from the cockpit, which was the 180 people behind that door, and whether those people would be a panicking mob or an orderly line when it opened. That was my job tonight. And I did it the only way I knew how, 1 row at a time, 1 person at a time, in a voice that would not allow fear a place to stand. Behind me, the young flight attendant was moving through the cabin with a new steadiness. And somewhere up front, I knew she was speaking into an interphone with the cockpit, because that was what had to be done, telling the captain the state of the cabin before we touched down. I didn't know that in a few seconds. That interphone would change everything. The young flight attendant came to me, out of breath. "The captain wants to know the situation back here," she said. "He needs to know which doors are usable, how thick the smoke is. Can you talk to him? He can't step away from his instruments." She handed me the interphone. I have held hundreds of microphones in my life, on hundreds of frequencies, in places where 1 wrong word could keep someone from getting home. My hand knew the weight of a moment like that before my head could catch up. And with that weight, a stillness came over me, the stillness I can't summon at will anywhere else in my life, but that always comes when I need it. The noise of the cabin fell away. The fear fell away. What remained was only the work, and the voice that would do the work. I took it. And when I pressed the button and began to speak, the voice that came out of me was not the voice of the woman who had sat quietly with her compass the whole flight. It was the other voice, the one that had slept for 2 years, the one that had once read numbers into the dark for men trying to stay alive. Not fast. Not rushed. Just clear, brief, and absolutely calm. "Flight deck. This is an assisting passenger in the aft cabin. Smoke is light, stable, no visible fire in the cabin. The right overwing exit looks clear. The rear exits are ready. Passengers are set for brace position and evacuation. The aft cabin is under control." There was a short silence. Then the captain's voice came back, and something in it had changed, a sharper focus, as if he had just heard something underneath the words. "That report," he said. "The way you talk. Are you military? Let me hear your call sign." And I need to stop here for just a moment, because I know someone listening to this story recognizes that moment. The moment when a stranger sees the real person in you that your whole family spent years deciding wasn't there. If someone in your own family has ever shrunk you down into something you're not, leave a line in the comments and tell me where in the world you're listening from. I read everyone. Stay with me, because what happened in that cabin over the next 4 seconds, no one on that flight saw coming. Because the next moment was the one that all those years of silence had been building toward. I pressed the button. "Vesper," I said. "Commander Elena Vance, United States Navy, retired. EFA 18. Your flight attendant is doing an excellent job. We're going to get these people out." For 4 seconds, there was nothing on the other end of the line. Not because the line had failed. Because a man had just heard something that struck him silent. And in that silence there was only one sound, the faint hiss of the ventilation system, so soft that in ordinary times no one would ever notice it. Then up in business class, the plastic cup on Daniel's tray table slipped out of his hand and rolled once across the floor. And in the whole cabin there was only that rolling, because everything else had gone still. 4 seconds on an interphone, in the middle of an emergency landing, is a very long stretch. Then the captain came back, and his voice carried something new. A kind of reverence. "Vesper," he said, slowly, as if he could hardly believe it himself. "I know that name. Commander, this is my honor. I'll fly the airplane. The cabin is yours." And then he did something I hadn't expected. He switched to the public address, so the whole airplane could hear, and in the voice a captain uses when he needs a whole cabin of people to believe in something, he said. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain. We will be landing in a few minutes. There is a Navy fighter pilot on this flight, Commander Vance. When I give the order, follow her and the flight attendants immediately, without hesitation. She knows exactly what to do. The whole cabin heard it. And in business class, a very small thing happened. The kind of thing only 2 people on this flight could understand the meaning of. My brother, who less than an hour earlier had been telling the man beside him that his little sister was a failure, went suddenly still. His hand gripping the armrest stopped. And the man next to him, who had just heard the whole story about that regrettable little sister, turned to Daniel, his face loose with relief, and said the worst thing a person could have said to him in that moment. "Thank God," he said. "Thank God there's someone like that on this plane." And Daniel couldn't say a word. He couldn't say that woman was his sister, because to do so would expose everything he had just said about her. So he sat there, mute, caught in a truth he could neither deny nor claim. Then I watched the man beside him slowly turn to look at him again, longer this time, because a man does not forget a last name he heard 10 minutes ago attached to a sad little story. Vance. The whole cabin had just heard the name Vance. And I knew, though I couldn't see it, that the man had just put the 2 pieces together. I thought about all the rooms Daniel had walked into and filled with his version of me, all the relatives who had nodded and believed, all the years when his story was the only story told, because I had never come to tell the other one. And now in a cabin full of smoke, among 180 strangers, the truth was finally spoken, and it wasn't spoken by me. It was spoken by a captain I had never met, broadcast over a loudspeaker for everyone to hear, and that gave it a weight my own words could never have carried. Sometimes the truth needs a voice other than yours before people will listen to it. But I had no time for any of that. Below the night rain, a runway was waiting, and I still had a cabin full of people to bring down onto it. We broke out of the low clouds, and below, through the rain, the runway appeared. At first it was only 2 rows of dim lights in the dark, blurred behind the rainwater on the window, far off and small. Then they grew larger, grew clearer, 2 parallel lines of light cutting through the wet night, and all at once the thing that had been only darkness and rumor became a real place, a place to set the wheels down, a place to come home to. There was nothing dazzling about it. Just cold runway lights under a raining sky. But when you've been in the dark long enough, there is nothing more beautiful than the first light that shows you the way home. I sat down in my seat. I fastened my belt. My job now was not the cockpit. It had never been the cockpit tonight. It was the next 10 minutes, when the wheels touched the ground and 180 people had to get off this airplane in order instead of in chaos. But I trusted the man in the cockpit. I had heard his voice. I knew what kind of pilot he was just from the way he spoke, and the way he spoke told me he was going to bring this airplane down. And he did. The airplane touched down firm and fast. Exactly the kind of landing you make when the only thing that matters is getting everyone onto the ground. It rolled along the wet runway, slowing, and by the time it came to a stop, everything was ready, because for the past 10 minutes the cabin had been prepared instead of abandoned to its fear. I have been on many airplanes when they touched the ground, thousands of times, on carrier decks and runways in places I'm not allowed to name. But never had I felt the ground receive me as gently as it did that night. Not because the landing was smooth. It wasn't. It was firm and decisive the way it needed to be. But because I knew the cost of not getting down. I had seen it. I had flown alongside it. And every time the wheels touch the ground and hold, a very old part of me quietly thanks the earth for once again agreeing to take us back. Red and blue lights slashed through the rain as the fire trucks raced in. The doors opened. The slides deployed and swelled. And the evacuation, the thing that could have become a tragedy of people trampling each other, happened in order. The man at the overwing exit opened his door on command, and he helped people out, exactly as I had given it to him to do. The young flight attendant led her section with a steadiness she hadn't known she had half an hour before. One by one, person by person, they slid down into the rain, out of the smoke-filled metal tube and out into the wet dark, alive. All 180 people got out. Not one was seriously hurt in the evacuation. Later people would say that was rare, that an emergency evacuation with no one crushed, trampled or trapped is not a common thing. But it didn't happen by chance. It happened because a cabin full of frightened people had been given things to do instead of being left alone with their fear. I was one of the last to leave. I walked the length of the cabin before I went, checking the rows out of old habit, making sure no one had been left behind. Because there are parts of me that will never step off an airplane while knowing someone might still be inside it. Then I reached the door, and I slid down into the rain, and I set my feet on the wet ground of an airport I had never been to, under a black sky, among the emergency lights. And only then, only once 180 people were safe on the ground, did I let myself think about the man in business class. They gathered us into a covered area at the edge of the apron, blankets around our shoulders, counting heads, calling for buses. The rain had softened into a thin mist. And in the crowd of people trembling from the cold and from the relief that comes after surviving, I saw Daniel walking toward me. He stopped a short distance from me. For a long moment he just looked at me, and I saw on his face something I had never seen there in our whole lives. He didn't know what to say. The man who always had a story ready for every room now stood in front of his sister without a single word. I knew what I was waiting for. A very old, very tired part of me was waiting for him to reap what he had earned. 10 years of stories. 10 years of being shrunk down at family dinners. He had just stood there and heard a whole cabin told to trust the sister he called a failure, and he knew that I knew he had heard it. I had imagined this moment. For years, there had been nights when I built it up in my head, the version where I said all the things I had never said. But standing there in the rain, watching my brother fail to find a single word, I no longer felt any wish in me to take anything back. Finally he spoke. And he didn't make excuses, didn't explain, didn't try to turn the story toward his own advantage, the thing he had done his whole life. He just said, quietly in a voice that broke in the middle, "I told it wrong about you. For all these years. I know I told it wrong." It was the first time in my life I heard my brother Ruther say something true about me. I had waited for that sentence, or one like it, for nearly 20 years. I used to think that if that day ever came, it would carry the taste of victory. It didn't. Standing there in the rain, wrapped in the airline's blanket, listening to my brother finally speak the truth, I felt no victory. I only saw a man who had spent half his life defending a story, and who now stood in the ruins of it, with nowhere left to hide. I could have answered with any number of things. I could have listed off every year. I could have made him stand there and hear the full cost of the stories he had told. But my father once put a compass in my hand and told me a good ship is a ship that brings people home. And standing there in the rain, I understood that there was a way to bring my brother home too, and it wasn't to drown him. "Yes," I said. "You told it wrong." I didn't erase it for him. I didn't say it was okay. It wasn't okay. But I also didn't add anything to the weight he was already carrying. I let the truth stand there, bare and unadorned, between the two of us, and I let him be the one to carry it for the first time instead of me. Then I said the thing I thought he needed to hear more than anything else. "Keep the yard, Daniel. Keep the house. Keep the money. I never wanted any of it. I never fought you for it. And I'm not going to start now." I paused. "I only took the compass. That's all of our fathers that I ever wanted." He looked at me, and I watched him understand what I was saying, the thing underneath the words. That he had spent years fighting for and defending something I had never come to take. That the story he told about the greedy little sister who left was never true, not because she was noble, but because she had never wanted the thing he thought they were fighting over. And I saw something in him soften. Not healed. That would take more than one night and one rain. But softened. A door opening a crack, where before there had been only a wall. Here is what happened to the people on that flight, and to my family, after that night. You know whether a moment was real by the marks it leaves behind. The young flight attendant wrote me a letter a few weeks later. She said she had nearly frozen that night, that she felt the whole cabin slipping out of her hands, and that the moment I touched her arm and handed her half the work was the moment she found her feet again. She said she would remember it for the rest of her flying career. I kept that letter. There are thank yous worth keeping more than any medal. The man at the overwing exit found me online and sent a short note. He said he had panicked to the point of nearly doing something that could have killed everyone, and that being given a task had pulled him back. He said he still thinks about it. I believe him. The captain, whom I never met face to face, sent word through a few hands, a scrap of paper with exactly one line. "There are voices you recognize even when you've never heard them before," he wrote, "because you know where they come from. I keep it in a drawer, next to the compass." As for me, a few months later a record was filed somewhere too, a report about that night. I know it exists. I have never read it, and I have never asked for it. I don't need a piece of paper to confirm what I did. 180 people went home. That is the only record I need. Daniel and I did not become different people overnight. That's not how things like this go. But he called me the following week. And then the week after that. On those calls, he didn't tell stories. He asked. He asked me about the years he had spent getting me wrong, and I told him the parts I could tell, and he learned not to ask about the parts I kept silent. At our father's memorial, when he stood up to speak, he mentioned his sister, and for the first time he got it right. Some of the relatives sitting in that room had heard Daniel's version for years, the version where I was the cold daughter who left. They had never heard the other one, because I had never told it. And I still didn't tell it, even after that night. But they heard it from Daniel himself, standing at the lectern speaking about his sister in the right words. And they heard it from a story that spread back to the harbor town, about a flight and a cabin full of smoke and a woman who brought everyone down to the ground. I didn't have to go around correcting the story about myself. It corrected itself, slowly, through the people who had been there, and through a brother who finally chose to tell it right. I think that was the real gift I gave him in the rain that night. Not forgiveness. A door to walk through with a little of his dignity intact, and a true story to tell in place of the old one. As for the name, now you know it. Vesper. The first star of the evening. The voice that rings at dusk to tell people they're almost home. The door into that night at sea that gave me the name stays closed, and always will. There are parts of a life that aren't meant to be told, only to be carried. I went back to my quiet life. No one who meets me at the store or on the street could guess any of it, and I don't tell them, and no one asks. But sometimes in the evening, when the sky darkens and the first star appears low on the horizon, I step outside and I stand there for a while. I take my father's compass out of my pocket. Its needle still settles, steady, unwavering, pointing the way it always points. Home. If you're listening to this, and there is someone in your own family who has spent years telling a story that shrinks you down into something you're not, I want to leave you with this. You don't need to argue back at them. You don't need to drown them to stand up straight. There are people who will only see the real you when life forces them to look, and until that day, your job is not to make them look. Your job is to keep being who you already are, quietly, completely. People can take the yard. People can keep the house, keep the money, keep the story. But there is one thing no one can write into or strike out of a will, and that is the person you were born to become. For some, that is building the things that carry others home. For some, it is becoming the voice that guides them home through the dark. That is the real inheritance. And no one can take it from you. And if there has ever been someone in your life who shrank you down into something you're not, share this story with them, or with someone you know who needs to hear it. Somewhere above me, the first star of the evening stood still against the darkening sky, and in my hand, my father's compass needle still pointed one single way, steadfast as it always was. Home.